Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line, from the eastern section of the front line to the southern section of the front line. But the Russians have advanced in the direction of Kurakhove in the Zaporizhia section. They've also managed to advance in the direction of Remivka, west of Velika Novosilka, reaching a wider front, the road, the last remaining one supplying the Ukrainian forces within the settlement. The Russians have made significant advances within and just south of Kurakhove. In the northern flank, in the direction of Pokrovsk, there are several advances by the Russians, all of this totaling over 20 square kilometers. The Russians have also advanced within Toretsk itself, and in the Devorishny direction, they have expanded their foothold across the Oskil river line. Starting out in the south, we see in the direction of Zaporizhia, the Russians have managed to capture several fortified positions that they themselves built in preparation for the Ukrainian summer offensive. With this, they are slowly developing their offensive operations towards Novodanilivka, here to the south of Kurakhove. They've also previously developed offensive operations north of Snesterienka in the direction of Novoandrivka to start fighting over that settlement. So there are some positional fighting here in the direction of Kurakhove. In the western flank, we saw the Ukrainians capture Kamyansk in its entirety. That limits the Russian armed forces' capabilities to launch offensive operations from this direction, as if they were planning on capturing some of the settlements along the western flank of Kurakhove along the main highway, they now have their flank exposed through Kamyansk. The Russians had previously attempted to cross the river line to gain access to the northern flank. However, the Ukrainians have a significant defensive capability in the area, which they made use of to prevent any Russian river crossing from succeeding. Moving on to the Vermivka direction, there is several fortified positions captured by the Russians here to the south of the road, and with this, it's just a couple hundred meters between the Russian forces and the road itself. That means even small arms fire can hit any targets moving along the road, and the road is now under direct fire control of Russian forces with simple weapons such as an AK. But much more significantly, ATGMs, helicopters, anything in between is now within direct fire control of this road. The Ukrainians are unable to transport anything across this road without it being hit by direct fire of Russian forces. This means that there is currently no road in or out of these settlements that is under Ukrainian control, which they can move through freely. Instead, they'll have to move through the fields, and the current weather conditions limits their ability to do so. This means that the Ukrainian forces here within Velika Novosilka, Vremivka, and Niskushne are in a very difficult position due to a lack of supplies and a lack of ability to receive reinforcements or to send their own forces back, which means it's only a matter of time until the Russians gain full control over the three villages. In the direction of Kurakhove, significant developments have taken place. The Russians have advanced within the city itself. They've also managed to capture significant portions of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the southern flank of Kurakhove, aligning the front line from the southern direction with the entirety of the industrial zone. And with this, the Russians are now very close to a complete physical encirclement of the city itself. Cutting off the city from the surrounding areas will also allow the Russians to start attacking the wider flank, which is the direction of Konstantinopel and Andrivka from the northern and southern directions, which would turn the current situation from terrible to even more terrible for the Ukrainian forces, considering this situation right now threatens a complete encirclement of the Ukrainian grouping within Kurakhove, and it can turn into a complete encirclement of the entire grouping from Yasenove and along the highway towards Andrivka, and to the south towards Konstantinopel and Ruslev, which will encircle 5 additional villages on top of Dashne and Kurakhove, which are located within the fortified areas. This could cause a complete collapse of this section of the front line all the way to the Dnipro region. The initial Russian advances in the Kurakhove direction was located with this footage here, confirming the advance to the northwestern outskirts of the first initial advance and their capture of the apartment complex center area in Kurakhove, leaving only the industrial area remaining under Ukrainian control. At the same time, it's also allowed the Russians to then, according to Russian sources, advance further to gain control over these fortified positions in the southern outskirts of the settlement, connecting it with their capture of the apartment complex area, allowing them to get an oversight of the entire area. This has allowed for significant progress along the fortified positions, which are largely unmanned because the Ukrainian forces have either withdrawn from the city or towards the industrial zone. The industrial zone is very large. There are several industrial buildings, and these are all very difficult to bombard because of how heavily reinforced the buildings themselves are to begin with. And in addition to that, there are several upgrades that have been made to defend these areas as cities. To put it into perspective, this is Chesev Yard, the industrial zone right here is just a few buildings, and in this it is reported that somewhere between 150 to 200 Ukrainian soldiers are present. And if we take that and compare it with Kurakhove, which is several times larger, it could easily add up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers within the industrial zone. However, so far there is no report on how many Ukrainian soldiers there are. If the Ukrainians already started a withdrawal from the city, it would be significantly less. Or if they instead concentrated a lot of their forces, it could be more. But it's likely it would be somewhere in the hundreds that are present in the industrial zone of Kurakhove. Further north, the Russians have managed to capture several fortified positions northwest of Surya as they develop offensive operations towards Slovianka, here to the west of the village. The Russians have also captured a fortified position west of Ukrainka as they align the front line along the river line that moves through here through Ukrainka, and have advanced further towards Novoye Lisavetivka, where they are looking to gain a foothold in the southern flank as well. The Russians are here advancing further along the main highway between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, south of Novolenivka, where they are continuously developing defensive operations for the encirclement of the wider Kurakhove area. In the southern flank, they are already at the outskirts of Ruslev and Konstantinopel. That means that the next move will be an assault directly on these settlements. This is why they're waiting for the northern flank to catch up by capturing Yasenoe and some of the other settlements in the northern flank until they reach the outskirts of these settlements, as the Russians would have to capture some of these fortified positions in the northern flank before they start storming the southern settlements, as these are located on the high ground above these settlements located along the Vovcha river line, which are all located on the low ground. That means that the Russian forces would be exposed by the Ukrainian forces in the northern flank of the Vovcha river line if they are to storm the southern one. But if the Russians capture the fortified positions north of the river line and capture the settlement of Enderivka, then the Russians would have this advantage on their side, which would force the Ukrainians to practically abandon these settlements on the southern bank of the river line. This will allow for a very successful offensive operation by the Russians if they were to wait rather than attack now, which would be very difficult instead. Further north along the Pokrovsk section of it, the Russians are advancing towards Novovasilivka and Spinivka and Solona, here in the northwest of Novotritsky, following the capture of the settlement. The Russians have a secure supply line from Sedidove to Novotritsky. This allows the Russians to develop offensive operations towards the Dnipro region. At the same time, they continued offensive operations towards the main highway west of Pokrovsk as they advance through Pishane and to the eastern flank of Vovkove, which they already have a foothold in the southern flank of the settlement. This is to gain control over some of these fortified positions and gain control over the highway and railway going to the southwest of Pokrovsk through towards Zaporizhia in the west. There's the northwestern one as well, which goes through Pavlorad towards Dnipro. So we see each of these highways and railways go to a different city. The Russians are looking to cut off both of these, significantly limiting the supply of the Ukrainian forces in the area. There's also this coke plant here in the northwest, which is a very important one, and the Russians are now very close to it. This coke plant here provides a significant amount of natural resources, which are needed to develop other natural resources the Ukrainians have available. It would therefore have a significant impact on the Ukrainian economy, or what is left of it, despite how little it is. It is a modernized and well-developed one. We see it with how in satellite imagery it is well-developed compared to any of the other plants in the Donetsk region. Because it is so far from the front line, it has been able to function properly through this wartime. But now that the Russians are closing in on it, they can gain full control of it and prevent the Ukrainian use of it. It also allowed the Russians to use it as a military base here west of Pokrovsk, as they developed offensive operations towards the northern road, towards Dnipro, and towards the Dnipro region itself. They can use Udashna itself along as a railway station, and the coke plant north of it as a fortified zone, and develop offensive operations towards Zaporizhia from this road. Therefore, this area right here will be a very significant battle for it. If the Ukrainians do not defend it properly and hold back the Russians from taking control of it, the defense of Pokrovsk will not last a long time. Much less will it be the Ukrainian capabilities to build up defenses ahead of a Russian offensive, because the Russian capture of these positions will allow them to start the preparations for such an operation directly. In the Toretsk direction, there is this small advance by the Russians towards Krymske, where they're now reaching the outskirts of the industrial zone in the northern parts of Toretsk. Near Pokrovsk, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of Vidoroshenya and Dashenske, capturing both of the settlements south of the Soloniy River. They've also advanced further towards Zelene, where they are fighting along the northern bank of the river line, following the capture of these settlements. The Russians will also likely intensify the offensive operation near Lysivka and Silkhyar to develop offensive operations to gain full control over the first line of defense ahead of Pokrovsk, as the offensive also continues directly towards the city and not just on the western flank. In the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced further along the western bank of the Utsky River line, where they've captured more of the forest patches and forest lines along the river line, expanding their bridgehead across the river line and their ability to send additional troops across without relying on too few crossings. The Russians continued offensive operations all across the front line, where the Ukrainians are completely on the backtrack. The Russian advances and offensive operations have sped up and intensified over the past week, following about a week or two of slowed down advances. This is likely a beginning of a new offensive all across the front line, including the Kursk direction, where the Russians are now making a lot of progress, but it is still too little to gain full control over all four regions in 2025. Instead, we're likely to see that although the fighting has intensified, it will not speed up before significant areas are taken, such as Velika Novosilka, Kurakhove, and Pokrovsk, as well as Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and other important logistical hubs and fortified areas that the Ukrainians still hold on to. Once these fortified areas have fallen under Russian control, the Russian progress will likely significantly speed up, and this will lead to a rapid collapse of Ukrainian lines that are not well prepared. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.